Just one quick scheduling update for you all. Tomorrow, before departing for the Gulf, the President will stop with the Vice President at a business in Hyattsville, Maryland, to comment on the May employment numbers that will be, as you know, released tomorrow. They will visit the K-Neal International, a commercial truck dealership and truck parts supplier. The President and Vice President will do a tour with workers, and the President will make brief remarks to pooled press. So that is scheduling. That's Mr. Feller.
Thank you, Robert. I have a few questions about the Romanoff matter. Following up on your email this morning, did the President sign off on the White House's approaching Romanoff about the prospect of jobs to get him to?
The President wasn't aware of that.
He wasn't aware? No. What is his reaction to this?
I haven't talked to him about it today.
You don't know of any?
I haven't talked to him about it today.
We now have 2 confirmed cases of the White House actively seeking to encourage Democratic candidates to bow out of primary challenges. How can you contend that this isn't politics as usual?
Well, Ben, I think the leaders of parties have long had an interest in ensuring that supporters didn't run against each other in contested primaries. That's what was done in this case.
Do you think that the White House has been transparent about this? It seems like the details of this, if in fact it's legitimate, have rolled out later only.
If in fact what is legitimate?
That has the White House been transparent about these offers? If in fact nothing's done wrong, why has it taken so long for all this to come out?
I think you all have received quite a bit of information over the past week on this, and I do believe we've been transparent, yes.
You do?
I do.
So overall, does the President stand by these?
Stand by
These offers to
again, the President has, as the leader of the party, has an interest in ensuring that supporters don't run against each other in contested primaries, yes.
But that makes it sound like he did know about them then.
No, he's not aware of the individual circumstances. I don't think it's, we went through a pretty contested primary. They're not altogether fun things. Does the leader of the party have an interest in ensuring that primaries that tend to be costly aren't had so that you're ready for a general election? Of course.
Can you talk about what the President hopes to accomplish on tomorrow's trip? And can you talk a little bit about what he's going to be doing down there and what does he hope to accomplish that he didn't do on the last 2 trips?
Well, look, I think, and we'll have some scheduling details for you all shortly. I think the President will likely see governors again. I think the President will speak with individuals and business leaders likely that have been affected directly by the economic consequences of the spill, and continue to get from Admiral Allen a firsthand update on our progress, both in dealing with the well and in dealing with the spread of pollution that has leaked from the well. I think the President believed that last week's trip was tremendously productive. We had about a 2-hour meeting with parish presidents from Louisiana affected by the spill, senators and a congressman from Louisiana, governors from many of the Gulf states, and I think along with the Coast Guard, and I think the President believed it was a productive atmosphere in ensuring that everybody's causes and concerns were heard and ultimately met.
Can you talk about the criticism that the President isn't making that emotional connection with people over the spill?
Yeah, this one is, I said this last night, if jumping up and down and screaming were to fix a hole in the ocean, we'd have done that 5 or 6 weeks ago. We'd have done that the first night. I think we're going to be judged, and the President will be judged on our response and our recovery efforts to what we all know now is the worst environmental disaster in our nation's history. But pounding on a podium isn't going to fix a hole in the ocean. I think what the American people and the citizens of the Gulf are expecting are results. And I think that's what the President will be measured by. I'll leave emotional psychiatry to others. Hold on, I'll get back to that.
Can I just ask a quick
Yeah.
question about you mentioned the May jobs report, and I was wondering where things stand with the effort to get that jobs bill through. Some Democrats are worried about the budgetary implications of that and tying it into the Gulf. Are you concerned that his political capital is a little weakened from this? And that
How so?
just the fact that he's dealing with a lot of criticism over this right now, and that's taking a lot of time, a lot of White House time, maybe.
No, again,
maybe
look,
possibly a distraction.
No, look, I said this earlier this week. I think no White House at any time has the luxury of picking the events that it deals with, both on a domestic and an international, and on the international scene. That's part of the job. But the American people don't elect somebody, I think, that they don't believe can walk and chew gum at the same time. Sometimes it feels like we walk and chew gum and juggle on a unicycle all at the same time. I get that, but I think if you look at the progress that we've made let's go back the past 6 weeks. We've seen sanctions introduced in the UN Security Council that we believe will be voted on next week and approved by the UN Security Council. We've passed financial reform through the Senate, and I think it's likely that bill will be signed into law before the July 4th recess. We've nominated a Supreme Court justice that I believe will be confirmed before the August recess. We've completed fairly recently a New START treaty that we believe will be ratified by the end of the year. We'll get a chance tomorrow to evaluate the progress that we're making through the jobs report on our economic recovery. So we have had a very full agenda, not just in the past 44, 45 days, but for the past 16 months. But there's a whole lot of people working on a whole lot of things in the White House, and we're able to do more than several things at once. Yes, sir.
It's clear that the U.S. government knew about the flotilla before the Israeli army confronted it,
Right.
the Israeli Navy confronted it. What does the administration think the purpose of the flotilla was? Does the Obama administration think it was on a humanitarian mission? Does it think it was trying to provoke Israel into a reaction? What was the opinion of the government when it was talking to Israel about how to...
I've not asked NSC that directly, Jake. I can try to have NSC find out what... again, there's a blockade, as you know, to ensure that that weapons are not brought in for Hamas. At the same time, you've heard the President recently, and certainly the Secretary of State, discuss what we believe is an unsustainable humanitarian presence in Gaza.
Does the President, I assume the President knows that one of the dead was an American.
He does.
What was his reaction?
I'm told that upon being told this, obviously, he expressed his deep condolences, and we certainly express our deep condolences to his family. Obviously, this is extremely horrible news for them. Our ambassador has been in touch with his father, and I would reiterate that we have, with the UN Security Council, condemned the acts that have led to these deaths.
We talked about this before, and I understand that it was written the way it was, but by condemning the acts, that could condemn the people on the flotilla to a degree, but since I know that that's a lane that's not going to lead anywhere, let me just ask this. Does the fact that one of the victims was an American born in Troy, New York, change at all the U.S. View of what happened, or the U.S. position on what happened?
Well, not to somewhat go down the lane you were talking about. Again, I would reiterate we've condemned the acts and believe.
You can go down that lane, actually.
I understand. Well, I'm going down the other side of the street. That.
I already told him to go.
Yeah. No, but I look. We have called for, and the UN Security Council presidential statement calls for, a full and credible investigation, so that we have all the facts about what happened, and that is tremendously important. And we have. I said here just a couple of days ago that could include international participation in that investigation.
Doesn't it change it to a degree, the fact that one of the dead, one of those killed by the Israeli armed forces was an American? Doesn't that, by necessity, change the view of the U.S. government, of the American government, as to this?
Well, again,
It's different. I mean, I don't mean to sound callous, but
No, I understand.
if 10 Greeks are killed or 10 Turks are killed, the U.S. government might condemn the act and think it's a horrible thing. But it's different than if an American is killed.
Which, Jake, is why I started the answer to this question by expressing the deep condolences of the United States government and the President's condolences. Yes, sir.
Robert, there continue to be concerns about the deep water moratorium, drilling moratorium, and the impact that it could have over the next 12 to 18 months on jobs, existing jobs, or platforms moving away, and what that would mean to high-paying jobs. What is the White House reaction to the potential loss of employment?
Dan, this was something that the President discussed with his team prior to the release of the report that halted the 33 existing drilling actions. A situation we didn't take lightly, but I think it's important that we understand exactly why this accident happened, and ensure that if there is something that was preventable, that we ensure that every one of these activities, these drilling permits, takes any of that into account. Understand that what happened in this incident on the Deepwater Horizon was after the drilling reached the reservoir of oil, in the process of capping that well. So each of these 33 deepwater permits are at some depth toward reaching that well. So let's have an investigation to ensure that the capping of those exploratory wells with proper blowout preventers, fail-safe mechanisms that mean fail-safe, that we have a full investigation, and that's what the Commission is going to look into, a regulatory framework that can ensure safe drilling. I think that's important. The President thought that was important. I think that the citizens of the Gulf think that's important. I will say this, I think Governor Jindal sent that letter. Governor Jindal has been very critical, rightly so, of BP. 4 of those drilling permits were either solely or jointly operated by BP. I don't know if he's got more confidence in their drilling procedures than he does in their response efforts, but the President certainly believed that that was something that needed to be looked into before those permits were continued.
So the White House acknowledges then that there will be a loss of jobs,
I don't
but
think
that
there's
this
any doubt.
investigation has to go forward
Well,
to prevent this from happening again.
Understand this, there are loss of jobs because of what's happened, right? Your network and everybody else is interviewing fishermen that can't fish, right? You're interviewing hotel owners whose hotels, whose reservations have been canceled. So this is not a zero-sum game. And again, let's ensure that, as the President outlined and what he wants the Commission to look at, is that there is a regulatory framework that makes drilling as fail-safe as BP and other companies say it is. That's what's important.
Does the White House believe that it was a mistake for the President not to meet with fishermen or other local business people during his last visit?
He met with fishermen on May the 1st when we went down.
But what about on this? There have been some who criticized that he did not spend enough time talking to, the quote-unquote real people on the ground.
Well,
was that a mistake not to do that?
I will say the mayor of Grand Isle told, well, first of all, I think there was a pretty large representation of people in that room. The mayor of Grand Isle, who generally has, as he said, 10,000 people on his beach for Memorial Day weekend, wasn't likely to have any, as he said. He talked about putting his own credit card out to help fishermen who can't fish meet their expenses. Similar stories that the president got several weeks earlier from fishermen in the Gulf region. The president is well aware of the pain and suffering that this accident is causing, and that is why he's asked that we do everything we can. That's why very early on in this process, the Small Business Administration set up a process for many of those small business owners to obtain very low interest loans while economic damages are recovered from BP. I would say this too: the federal government will at some point today send what I would call a bill for $69 million of expenses incurred up to this point to BP to be reimbursed to the taxpayers as a part of the Oil Pollution Act for expenditures in response, for DOD expenditures in moving assets to the region, for a whole host of things that BP will be paying the taxpayers for.
69 million?
$69 million.
And how much time do they have to pay that? Is that?
I don't know what the time limit is on that.
Okay, and then.
That is the first bill, yes.
And since the White House has been, or the administration has been calling a lot of the shots on what takes place in this crisis in the Gulf, did the White House pressure at all BP to make the kind of public apology that we've been seeing from the CEO, in the print, and also this video release where he's been saying, "I'm sorry"? Did the White House push for this?
I don't know if others had conversations, whether Admiral Allen, who talks with the CEO, has had conversations. I don't think there's any doubt, Dan, that we've seen comments from the CEO that he's apologized for, rightly so. I don't look, I don't think a CEO needs to tell people in the Gulf that there's not any pollution or he'd like his life back. There's 11 people that we'd all like to have their lives back that were killed the very first night of this incident. And the harm that's being done there will take years to fix. We will hold BP responsible throughout this process.
Did anyone in the White House yell at him for making those comments?
I don't know the answer to that. Yeah.
Yeah. Robert, with the president first in the Rose Garden threatening, or at least talking about the possibility of criminal action, and then Attorney General Holder opening the criminal investigation, has that made the relationship with BP difficult in any way? I mean, there really seems to be a hostile relationship right now.
Not that I'm aware. What? How so?
Well, when you're talking about bringing criminal charges against someone, and then you're trying to work with them as a partner to solve a problem, doesn't that make the situation
They have an
more
obligation to fix the hole that's on the bottom of the ocean floor.
Right.
We have an obligation as the federal government to ensure that the laws of this country have been and are upheld.
But does that inevitably
I don't think
lead
so,
to
no.
a more difficult relationship and a more difficult time working together to get
Not
this
that
done?
I'm aware of, no.
Is the president, does the president believe, as some of his critics say, that he's kind of playing catch-up now, that he didn't go very often in the beginning? This will be only his third trip. Is he going to be going more regularly
I don't know. Which critic are you talking about?
You could name dozens of them.
Just
okay,
one?
let's go with Colin Powell and James Carville, who believe he was too slow out of the...
Yeah, I mean, best I can tell, I mean, each has said that we ought to have a comprehensive response. I think...
Well, they also said that he should have done what he did when he went down there. He should have done everything 2 weeks earlier.
Well, again, I don't know what their critique was on when the president was there on May the 1st, so, or May the 2nd, I'm sorry, it's the day after.
The visit the other day was tremendously, last week was tremendously productive.
It was tremendously
Well, if
productive.
he'd gone 2 weeks before, wouldn't it have been better
He
to be
went 3
tremendously...
weeks before,
But
and
wouldn't it have been
that
better-
visit was also productive.
But if it was tremendously productive that Friday, wouldn't it have been more productive to go the week before and the week before?
He went the week before, the week before, the week before.
But he didn't
Sure.
go all those in between.
You're right, he did not go each of the last weeks.
Is he going to be in the future, do you think?
He
This is 2 Fridays in a row.
will be there as often as the situation dictates. Obviously, we're dealing with the worst environmental disaster in our nation's history. We have mobilized the largest federal response in our nation's history. And we will continue to make sure that all is being done to plug the leak and to deal with the environmental and economic consequences of what that pollution has caused.
Is Indonesia still on?
I don't have any updates on the schedule. If I do, or as soon as I do, I'll certainly let you guys know.
Just to stay on that thing, how much of the president's schedule is being changed or altered due to the spill at this point? Can you just describe a little bit of how much of the president's day, his schedule?
I mean, he gets an update in the Oval Office each day between the daily intelligence briefing and generally the daily economic briefing. Carol and John Brennan, and like a whole host of issues, the president gets regular updates on. The president gets regular updates on a whole host of issues, including oil.
Is there, when you see a Jon Stewart mocking the president's time?
I got to tell you,
with sports-
Chuck, I haven't watched TV. I haven't watched TV in 2 weeks
And some of the
that isn't
ceremonial.
news. So
Fair enough.
I love Jon Stewart. He's a funny guy, but I have not watched him recently.
Critiques on how much time the president is spending on some of the ceremonial aspects of the presidency that he's had to deal with.
Chuck, we're still the president the president is the president 24 hours a day. I don't think he'd suggest we stop doing intelligence briefings on things like Afghanistan and Pakistan because of what's going on in the Gulf, just like what was going on in Afghanistan and Pakistan didn't limit what our response to the Gulf. I mean, this is, on any given day, the president is working on, even on the quiet days, and there haven't been many, even on the quiet days, the president is working on a whole host of issues. And again, I'd refer you back to what I said earlier. The notion somehow that our legislative schedule has somehow been curtailed. I don't. We seem to be well on track to get a new Supreme Court justice by the August recess. My hunch is we'll sign, again, a financial reform bill prior to the July 4th recess. We're going to get UN sanctions against Iran, which not a lot of people thought 6 weeks ago, at the beginning of this spill, we had a chance of getting. People didn't think we had a chance of getting this at the beginning of the week, I would point out. So I appreciate that sometimes you guys have one story, you do one story a day. We don't necessarily deal with just one subject every day.
A deputy at the Interior Department, Sylvia Baca, went from the Clinton administration to working for BP. Now she's back in the Obama administration in the Interior Department. Have you asked her to take a issue?
Nobody that comes into this administration can regulate any employer that they worked for previously.
She's totally been off.
Cannot work for
Off
on
of
anything relating to that.
And was it when you say you quoted Tony Hayward just now about his comments that he made about his own life, trying to get his own life back? Do you think at this point he is no longer a helpful face for
Well,
BP?
I would say I'm not going to do their PR. They'll make their decisions on who they think should brief, who they think should talk to the American people. I do hope this. I do hope that the company continues to answer the questions that I think the American people want to know the answers to. That's important to do.
And one more thing, have you been briefed on the next plan? Every time there seems to be every one of these attempts at stopping the leak. The next plan has been in the works. Are you guys aware of the next plan that's in the works? If this fails?
Or the next 10.
Yeah.
Or at least the next one.
Well, I would
Yeah.
say this. Look, there always was, based on the type of cap that will go on the riser, was predicated on the, for lack of a better term, the smoothness of the cut. So I believe there are several different caps that are there. I'm told that they're moving ships into the region, or I'm sorry, moving ships over the well. The cap will be lowered in slowly to ensure that the hydrates problem that we encountered with previous attempts you minimize. Look, there will continue to be contingencies on
The history
on
of
what
this
happens.
bill already has
Right.
been.
But
each one of
look,
these
I
things
think
has
it's
failed, and
important.
then they go
I
to
do
the
think
next
it's
thing.
important to understand. There is one permanent solution. That's a relief well. BP began to drill that relief well. I think one of the things that we've certainly already taken from this is you need to have built-in redundancy into the system. That's why we asked them to start drilling a second well. And if for some reason a problem is incurred in either of those first 2 wells, we'll ask them to drill a third well. So there's a whole host of different scenarios, Chuck, that we're working through. Jonathan?
On Romanoff, part of the defense on the Joe Sestak matter was that it was an unpaid position, and it was done through an intermediary, Bill Clinton. In this case, these were 3 potentially paid positions done by the Deputy Chief of Staff. Does that make the Romanoff job offer fundamentally different and perhaps fundamentally more troubling?
Let's be clear. There wasn't a job offered. There wasn't a job promised. Mr. Romanoff applied for a job in government service during the transition. I think that's the fact pattern.
Right, but if I apply for a job and then an employer comes back and says, how about these 3? Does my application for the job change the fact that I might have been offered those 3 jobs?
No, I don't. Let's walk away from your hypothetical and or add to your hypothetical that when you applied for that job, you expressed an interest in several different departments like USAID.
And on BP, I'm sorry, quickly back to BP.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, have you heard anything from the flow rate people, like the U.S. Geological Survey, on what they are seeing from the cut riser? And do you feel like the images, at least, are substantiating what you thought would happen and what BP did not think would happen?
Jonathan, it's a good question, and I'll have somebody go. I do not know of any new estimates from the flow rate technical group. Again, we thought it was important that, based on what we heard from Dr. McNutt at USGS, who's the head of the flow rate technical group, that that cutting the top off that riser would likely or could increase the amount of hydrocarbon by 20%. I do not know if they have, and I'm not entirely sure that you could altogether ascertain just from the flat screen image of the riser cut the degree to which that hydrocarbon flow had indeed increased. But let me check on the flow rate technique. Yeah.
Excuse me. If the U.S. is in charge of this oil spill, why is the BP Corporation going to be giving operational updates?
Well, I look that we're the remotely operated vehicles. The sheer cut operation is being conducted by them, as we've said, because they're the only people in this scenario that have the type of technical expertise. In order for a cut with the diamond saw or a shear cut to happen, the federal on-scene coordinator, Admiral Watson, has to sign off on that. Rear Admiral Watson, sorry.
So you're fine with BP continuing to have a voice?
I think it's important that BP continue to have a voice. There are, I assume that there are, I love Thad Allen. I don't think he's, there are certainly technical questions that BP can and should answer. And I think the American people and the citizens of the Gulf are owed an explanation about, from BP of what they're seeing and what's going on.
Can you be a little more specific about the president's trip tomorrow? What his goals are? What does he hope to accomplish and bring home, and
well, again,
any results to show?
As I said to Karen, I think that the evaluating on the ground every effort of the response, both on the surface of the water and in the environmental damage that's been done, but also in the economic damage that's been and being done in the Gulf to small business owners everywhere down there. I think he'll get a chance again to talk to some of those folks and get a chance to talk directly with Admiral Allen again, as well as understand how each state in the Gulf is implementing its own state response plan and whatever concerns they have in wanting to augment the plans developed by them for a spill.
So a fact-finding trip.
Well, I think the president will want to hear any update that's going on, but also hear directly from, as he did in the first trip, hear from non-elected individuals who are also suffering firsthand at this, as are those that those officials represent.
One quick question on the flotilla. Before this incident happened, the U.S. government urged Israel to exercise caution and restraint. Does the White House feel that Israel heeded those words?
Well, let me just say, there are a lot of questions that you all may have that I think will be helped by the investigation that the United States has called for. We would continue to encourage Israel to, while maintaining a blockade, not to have, I think we all, none of us want a repeat of what happened. But,
How much meeting of the minds was there in the president's meeting today with Arizona Governor?
I was not in the meeting, but I think you heard her say, and I think there's a readout from our office that will go out discussing efforts that the administration has made along the border with the National Guard and other devices to strengthen border security. Obviously, a long discussion about comprehensive immigration reform, which again I think you heard the governor discuss, which is the only way that we're going to solve this crisis. It is not going to be solved by one method alone.
She said that she'd like to see construction of a fence begin in a month or so. Is that likely?
I need to get an update on that. I saw that out of the meeting, and I have not had a chance to talk to anybody.
On the China's decision to rescind the invitation to Secretary Gates, do you see that as a direct result of the Taiwan arms sale? Is there another reason for it?
I don't know. I'd direct you to the Department of Defense on that.
Does it have implications for U.S.-China relations?
Well, again, we have there was a you have two countries that disagreed on our arms sales, and countries like China and the United States are going to have times in which, whether it's North Korean sanctions in front of the UN last year or Iran sanctions that are in front of the UN this year, where we agree, and there'll be issues that we disagree on, and that's what you have in international relations.
A couple of questions on the commission, the oil spill commission. Does the president believe everything should be on the table in terms of the recommendations that the commission might ultimately come to in regards to the future of oil drilling?
Yes.
And so does that include the possibility that they could recommend that the risks of drilling in deep water are simply too great and that it should be stopped?
Well, look, I assume they will look at that, and I think the president would want to be assured, as he certainly said in meetings here, that at the very least you have to have a plan, a credible plan for responding to what potentially could happen, to ensure that you can stop something that you start. Which 45 days later we know BP is not showing good results on. I will say this: there are thousands of wells in the Gulf, and as we have slowed deep water permits, we have continued exploratory drilling in shallow water. That continues, and they're continue to evaluate permits to continue to drill in shallow water, because I think the last time I saw the number was around 60% of our oil is imported from overseas. We have to break our dependence on foreign oil. The president outlined a comprehensive strategy that included more drilling because we're going to have to take steps to break our dependence on foreign oil. That's why we've invested in a whole host of clean energy projects through the Recovery Act. But at the same time, we're all still driving cars.
But so I guess that almost suggests that that if they were to come back and say, look, I mean, as there are environmentalists and others out there who say, drilling is just too dangerous. Fundamentally, in that deeper water, just is never going to be safe.
Well, look, I think the president has been very candid in asking this commission to look at not just the companies, but obviously he's not spared the government the rod on this as well, in terms of ensuring that there's a regulatory framework that works for the American people. Again, there are thousands of wells down there that are producing oil that we're going to use right now. So the commission has a lot of breadth in dealing with and in examining that regulatory framework.
One last question on the setting up the commission. Do you have any guidance on when he's going to be naming the rest of the folks, and in terms of
in the next couple of days? I think they're finishing that up now.
And the staff that, I mean, they have to find the
They
place to be and all
will
that.
find executive director and relevant staff too to begin to handle a whole host of questions. One of which they'll look at, which are the 33 current permits that have been frozen.
Robert, you just said earlier that you're very confident that the U.S. will be able to get through an Iran sanctions resolution through the UN.
Yeah.
Are you saying then that the Israeli flotilla incident had no effect at all on our efforts on Iran?
Well, I've obviously not spoken with each of the 15 members of the UN Security Council. I think the president and the team here remain confident that we start with the P5+1 in support of that resolution, and believe that when that resolution is voted on, likely within the next week, that we'll have a number that will pass that resolution.
And back to taking the president's emotional temperature, I just want to get back to something that Jake asked you about on the American who was killed in the flotilla. You said the president was very sorry. Was he angry?
I was told he expressed his condolences. I was not in this. I think was during the PDB, and I was not in the PDB.
Briefly, Robert, on the Romanov issue, are there other offers that have been made to clear primary opponents away?
I'm sorry?
That we know about? Are
Nothing.
there other offers? Okay. Your defense of this practice, can we expect the White House staff will continue to look on that as a possible means of preventing people running against each other?
I think I would draw you to the circumstances that we've talked about in each one of these cases.
And they're peculiar. They're peculiar. Those circumstances are not likely to be repeated.
I would point you to the fact pattern in each one of them.
Robert, a quick question on the meeting with the governor of Arizona. She said the solution for the illegal immigration problem should be border security first and then immigration reform. Is the president agreeing in that order for the solution?
Well, I think the president believes that those things have to happen together. Look, if there was one solution to this crisis, my guess is somebody would have either tried it or done it long ago. We know that's not the case. I think the president has outlined his beliefs on this. His record in the Senate demonstrate this, and the work that he's done here to encourage a bipartisan solution to a very emotional issue is something he continues to work on. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Robert. On North Korea, the U.S. has existing economic sanctions against North Korea under the UN Security Council Resolution 1874. Will the U.S. continue to provide humanitarian aid to North Korea?
Well, let me check with NSC on that. I don't know of any change in that, but I will double check on that. Yeah.
Robert, question on the National Guard troops heading down to the border. In his news conference last week, the president said this wasn't a response to the Arizona immigration law. In fact, it was part of a plan that had been discussed since as early as last year. So my question is, what is it a response to? What happened to make him think the border wasn't secure enough right now?
Well, I think I don't think this is a problem that has. This is a problem that has. I think if you go back several administrations, you see that at different time periods there have been more National Guard on the border. During the Clinton administration, I think during at 4 different times, they moved members of the National Guard to the border, several different times during the Bush administration. Obviously, what has what President Calderon has done to fight crime and gangs is something that has caused increased violence as well. Okay.
Robert, the full and credible report on the flotilla incident, just for timing purposes. Well, first of all, who's doing it? Do you know who exactly?
It's an Israeli investigation.
It's an Israeli investigation?
That's my understanding, yes.
Well, wait, you guys didn't support, you guys came out supporting for an independent investigation.
And which is why I said 2 days ago that could include international participation. I would point you to them.
Do you know anything about timing of a report like that? Are we talking about like a week or?
I don't know.
Another scheduling thing.
Mm-hmm.
The Indonesia trip is still on the schedule.
Yes, I said earlier that if I know yeah, exactly. If anything changes, we'll let you know.
Okay, and also, just could you say how the meeting with Governor Brewer came about? Was that did the White House invite her, what, and why?
I think she requested the meeting. I don't know when she requested. I saw an email several days ago that we were adding that meeting.
And why did the president decide he wanted to do that meeting?
Well, look, look, you're not going to deal with the immigration issue without dealing with what's happening along the border, and certainly Arizona is a big part of that. Obviously, Arizona has taken, because of a lack of a federal response in comprehensive immigration reform, has pointed to state efforts that the president believes could be harmful, and the Justice Department is evaluating that law for further action. But look, I don't think you're going to deal with comprehensive immigration reform and the circumstances around the border without dealing with Arizona. Yes, ma'am.
Thanks. Two-parter. I think even after seeing Governor Brewer come back out, many of us are not really clear what the point. I mean, did anything actually get accomplished in there? Does he feel that he's any closer of a mind with her on some of these conflicts? And do you expect that we'll see any other either follow-ups with her? She said some officials are going down there. He's not going down there, is he? I mean,
not that I'm aware of.
Did anything actually happen, or did they just like talk a lot?
I don't. Margaret, I don't. What are meetings like at McClatchy? Because I don't know. I don't. Maybe I'm going to the wrong meetings. Occasionally we look at our more than occasionally look at our BlackBerries. But look, They're viewpoints that she has clearly, and were expressed in her signature on a law about how we deal with immigration. As was said earlier, she's got a point of view that you have to do border security first. The president has a view that we have to have comprehensive immigration reform. But I'll say this, Margaret, I saw the governor say that one of the results of the meeting is, I think she believes will be better communication between the administration and her state, and I think that's always a positive development. But look, the president's talked about this. The president talked about this at the Republican caucus, and the president's talked about it here at the White House. John McCain was very instrumental in getting immigration reform to the point that it was in 2005, 2006, and 2007. I doubt we're going to get comprehensive immigration reform if we don't have John McCain doing what he believed in those years. She's the governor of that state, and hopefully will let both the senators of Arizona and throughout the country know that the way to best deal with immigration reform is to do it comprehensively at a federal level.
Another quick question.
Yeah.
When it comes to planning for the summer,
I do want to know about the McClatchy meetings, by the way.
Anytime.
That sounds.
When it comes to the Obamas planning their summer, is there any discussion now in light of the oil spill to them perhaps vacationing on a Gulf beach? Maybe that would be disruptive, but is that something that
I've
would
not been
bring-
involved in their August plans. I don't know the answer to that.
Thanks.
Thank you, Robert. Two brief questions. You said it was in the president's interest to see that supporters of his are not in a political conflict. Does that mean he's fully committed to campaigning for and supporting Congressman Kendrick Meek, the certain Democratic nominee for the Senate in Florida?
He supports his campaign for Senate, yes.
Okay, and he'll campaign for him?
I don't have a campaign schedule in front of me, but we're supportive of Congressman Meek.
Okay. And the other thing I wanted to ask you was, I forwarded you my correspondence from KBR, the spin-off company from Halliburton, which won a bid in a competitive contract, had it retained in an apparent no-bid contract. Could you address that now?
Well, I think, as you mentioned in that email, that it appeared as if the contract was simply, as you said, retained after a competitive bidding process, which I think is consistent with everyone's viewpoint, and I don't know if DOD has anything else to offer on that.
Okay, so you don't see it as contradicting the president's statement about no bid?
I don't. Mike?
Okay.
Purely factual question. 69 million. Can you break that down for us, so in a way that we can sort of extrapolate the rate at which the government is spending money and they're going to be billing BP?
The flow rate?
Will you have? I left one sheet on my desk on this, but I think LeBolt has that from. Give me 1 second, and I will.
And is that the sum total of the costs incurred so far?
Up to this point, yes. Let me get that. By the U.S. government, yes. Give me 1 second, and I'll. Ben LeBolt, please come to the front. Yes,
Robert. We've heard.
I was going to say it's a big test. Poor guy.
Robert, we've heard the president say over and over again around the country in these speeches that he's, where he decries sort of the Washington business as usual culture. And your defense of these two incidents with Sestak and Romanov, if I understand them, is essentially that this is Washington business as usual. Do you think that undercuts his larger argument? Do you think there's any hypocrisy there?
No, I think the ethics laws that we have, that our administration lives by, the transparency of allowing you to understand who comes into this White House, who they meet with, and when they come, not taking political contributions during the campaign from lobbyists and PACs, are differences in the way that Washington worked, Glenn, and those are efforts that we're quite proud of.
But we're not just talking about necessarily laws. We're talking about sort of the optics of the situation.
And this what I just outlined, none of those are laws. Those were executive orders and decisions that the president made.
But this is more than just sort of procedures and structure. This is an article of faith for the president. He talks about this stuff all the time. Does this disturb him at all? Does he want to?
Again, I did not talk to him about this.
Well, wait a minute. About Sestak, you didn't talk to him? You don't have his opinion. He asked specifically about Romanov.
Yeah,
but did he have an opinion about what happened with the Sestak
I have not talked to him
situation?
about Sestak. When on Friday I was with him in the Gulf and we were working on oil.
And other than those two, Robert, you guys have not tried to dissuade others. Okay. You ticked off.
Nothing.
You ticked off a bunch of the things that you guys have been doing, and you didn't mention Guantanamo. Have you put that on the shelf, closing Guantanamo, or where does that stand?
No, and in fact, I think a report was recently, I think, sent to Congress and recently made public of the evaluations that were done of the inmates at the Guantanamo prison. I have not heard any updates on decisions about criminal trials, though. I have not heard that. Ken?
Robert, does the news about a death of an American change the White House's perspective? As you know, the Turks were among the most vocal in criticizing the response from the White House. Is there any talk about maybe reevaluating, going back at this and making either another statement or weighing in somehow?
Well, again, I think our statement and the actions of the Security Council, and obviously the President had a good conversation 2 days ago with Prime Minister Erdogan, and I think it is important, as I've said before, that a full and credible investigation be had to understand exactly what the facts are. Sam? Oh, go ahead and then I'll go to Sam.
Robert, Senator Webb outlined in Bangkok his reasons for canceling his Burma visit, and I wonder, is the president still committed to the dialogue?
LeBolt's missing, so we'll get back to you, Mike. I'm sorry. Guy's working until like 10 o'clock at night, and he probably found lunch. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry about that. Is the president still committed to the dialogue with Burma's military government, and is there consideration being given to the special envoy that Senator Webb also?
Let me check with I just saw briefly that, but I have not a lot of guidance on that. Go there and I'll go.
Thank you, Rob.
Yeah.
You again, you listed a number of things that you plan to do legislatively. Is there anything specifically that you want to accomplish before the visit of the Russian president expected later this month?
Well, I don't think there'll be. I don't think anything legislatively prior to that. I know that we've certainly sent the new START treaty and the material up to the Senate, just as it has been done in Russia, and expect that we will continue to make progress and see that treaty is ratified by year's end. Sam?
Back on Sestak and Romanoff, I understand that the White House wanted to avoid a costly primary fight in each of those races. But what kind of message does this offering or dangling of job opportunities send to the people in those states who actually wanted a choice for their candidate, considering that both Specter and Michael Bennett were neither elected, both were led into office either through a party switch or an appointment from the governor?
I'm sorry. What's the question?
What kind of message is sent to the voters in those states who wanted a choice for their candidate for Senate? The Democratic primary.
Obviously, Pennsylvania is we've had a primary, and that's been done. Again, the president is supportive of, as we said months ago, supportive of incumbent Senator Michael Bennett, somebody who has done groundbreaking work, first as a superintendent, and is involved with a whole host of things that the president is supportive of, particularly as it relates to ethics.
But the argument among people like including a defender of yours, Richard Painter, the Bush ethics lawyer who actually defended the practice, is that it's seedy in the sense that you're not giving people a choice in their primary.
Sam, I think that's each individual state decides, I believe, how a vacancy is going to be filled, and I'm not going to get into those 50 state decisions. Thanks, guys. We'll get you the
Hey, Robert, instant
other
replay
stuff.
in baseball.
Well, I'll say this. Which one?
Detroit.
Well, you and I.
All right. All right.
A couple of things.
You're speaking for yourself there.
I'm speaking with the full weight of the federal government. For whatever that's worth. No, I'll say a couple of things. I hope that baseball awards a perfect game to that pitcher. Right. They're not going to do it?
They're not going to do it.
All right, well, we're working on it. No, I love Bud. We're going to work on an executive order. But I will say this. I will say, I think this. I have a 6-year-old right now who's playing baseball. I missed his gun. I missed his game. Yeah, I've seen a few pictures of your kids too, sir. Something we can all be proud of. I missed his game last night. 3 hits, just saying. But I think everybody that watched what happened and understood, there's been 20 perfect games in the history of baseball. To watch an umpire take responsibility and to watch a pitcher do what he did, the type of sportsmanship that was exhibited there, I think that gives a lot of heart, whether you're a 6-year-old just learning how to play baseball, Kirk, whether you're somebody like you or I who watch baseball for the sheer enjoyment of the game. I think it's tremendously heartening to see somebody understand that they made a mistake and somebody accept the apology for somebody who made that mistake. I think that's a good lesson in baseball. It's probably a good lesson in Washington. Thanks, guys. I haven't talked to them.